Welcome to all our listeners. Welcome to the COP26 Commitments, Mixed Priorities and Climate Scepticism episode of Ubuntunomics podcast. This week we'll be looking at the Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act, President Ramaphosa's working visit to Eswatini, the US and European pledge to finance climate just transition in South Africa, and record high fuel prices. And in the Africa Regional Update, we'll be looking at the SADC SIPS program, the ECOWAS-AU collaboration on peace and security, UN peacekeepers killed in the Central African Republic, and the climate famine in Southern Madagascar. And before we get started, just a request to all our listeners on whatever platform you're on, please hit us with a like or share the episode with your family and friends. And to keep up to date with all our future updates, hit the subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. With me this week is Sbu Nyati from Isakombe Assets. Hello Sbu, how are you doing this week?
Well, thank you, Sia. It's just that we had voting on Monday, and I would suggest we never have voting on Monday because I'm still in that voting mode. So yeah, the entire week has just been voting stuff. Okay, but I'm well though.
Yeah, definitely. And I think everyone has just been keeping their eyes on the results ever since Monday.
Yeah.
It's actually a null week. You're right.
Yes, it is, yeah.
And with us this week is Zama Matungandaba from M&M Legal. Hello Zama, how are you doing this week?
Hi there, Sia. Hi, Spoo. I'm doing well, thank you. And you? And I do agree. I am always just waiting in bated breath for election results. So yes, it is a null week, really. Here in SA.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think they're almost done at 99% the last time I looked. So I guess tomorrow we'll be ending off the week with the realities of the results. But without further ado, let's get started with the SA update this week. Our first story in the SA update, Regulation 28, published for comment. National Treasury has published the second draft amendments to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act for a 2-week public comment period until 16 November 2021. This follows inputs from 39 submissions that were received via the public comment process after the first draft was published in February 2021. The proposal to amend the pension funds regulation began in 2010 with the aim of limiting the amount and the extent to which pension funds may invest in particular assets to ensure prudent investment of retirement savings. The current amendment deals with issues such as strengthening the definition of the term infrastructure, caps investments in infrastructure at 45% for domestic assets and 10% for the rest of Africa, and eases reporting requirements to top 20 infrastructure investments by a fund, whilst also prohibiting investment in crypto assets. Zama, you think this is a good idea?
Definitely. I definitely think that we should be looking at limiting, the amounts at which pension funds invest in certain assets. We have to avoid, situations that happen, such as Steinoff, if you remember, which affected a lot of people's pension funds. So we do have to, ensure that pension funds are sufficiently diversified, is my first point. On my second point, when it comes to, the prohibition of the investment in crypto assets, particularly, I think this does make sense because of the fact that we're still dealing with the regulation of crypto assets in South Africa. However, I do have a slight passion and interest in cryptocurrency. And I think, where it's going and where it's headed, I think this move might be a little, short-sighted in my humble opinion. I don't know what you think.
I definitely agree with you there, Zama. In fact, whilst you're responding, I'm thinking in my head, the only reason the National Treasury is pointing towards in terms of what they're doing is sticking with the financial regulation working group in that the legislation is still being developed is that there's high volatility of crypto assets. But if I'm to be honest, if I wish for one thing that I would have done pre-COVID, or even as far back as 2012 or 2007, I think when Bitcoin came out, is I would have put all my investment savings in Bitcoin. I would have bought all of my money I would have put in Bitcoin. Like even in the last 3 years alone, I would have put all my money on Bitcoin. You know, like,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I mean, for me, firstly, well, there is a lot of volatility. I won't deny that, but it's been on the up for the last 3 years, generally upward tending, and I don't think that any other asset class is able to give you the kinds of returns that crypto assets are providing at the moment. Obviously, granted, there is the high risk, but yeah, if I'm to be honest, if I had the option of, putting my investment savings in indexed funds or whatever, or putting my money on crypto assets, I would have put all my savings in crypto assets. So what are your thoughts, Boo?
My thoughts are that this second draft is more about providing clarity with regards to existing asset classes. It updates the limits of how much a fund manager will be able to invest in each asset class. The asset class hedge funds or private equity and other assets which are not listed in the schedule has been split into the hedge funds as a separate entity and private equity and then the other assets not listed in the schedule. These are standalone asset classes now. That's the clarity that they've provided, because National Treasury want to be able to identify how much is spent on infrastructure, because current reporting as it stands is not explicit. So they wanted to sort that out. The fixed investment industry will object, as they usually do, to the proposals. But these actually give fund managers more freedom to choose investments, not less freedom. But, this entire amendment of Regulation 28 is business friendly. It's not adverse at all. There's also the revised definition of fixed investment as to what that really means. It says that it is any asset class that entails physical assets that are constructed for the benefits of society. For social and economic utilities. Yeah, that just sits well with me that they've clarified that, because they also talk about impact investment, which is something that we touched on last, I think, a fortnight ago, when we covered the story about how the National Treasury seeks to mainstream its budgeting to include the provision of or the insight into credit relevance and materiality of investments in terms of social and governance, those ESG factors. National Treasury has kept abreast with global developments because the world is moving away from just talking about DSGs. It's getting private investors to take more social responsibility. So these impact investments are investments made to generate positive, measurable social and environmental impact, alongside, of course, with financial returns. I am chuffed because this amendment to Regulation 28 of the Pension Funds Act seeks also to put in line private investment in that same fashion as public investment is being structured, because the world is shifting towards mitigating against things like embodied carbon in the built environment. So in fact, this amendment works to benefit private enterprise. But as we all know, South Africa's private sector is very intransigent. It takes time for them to pivot, to change and adapt. But this will work to everybody's favor. That's my position.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update: presidential working visit to Eswatini. President Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa, in his capacity as chair of the Southern African Development Community SADC organ on politics, defense and security, undertook a working visit to Eswatini for deliberations on political and security developments with King Mswati III. This follows the mission of the Special Envoy to Eswatini in October, which concluded that a national dialogue would be the appropriate platform to address the current challenges facing the country. President Ramaphosa's engagement with King Mswati included discussions on a broad range of matters relating to the political and security situation in the kingdom, but the working visit only achieved certainty that the national dialogue would be organized within the next 3 months with the help of the SADC Secretariat in drawing up the terms of reference for this dialogue. Zama, you have a view about whether South Africa and whether SADC is overreaching in this intervention at Eswatini.
Yes, I mean, okay, we recently covered the story about, what's been going on in Eswatini, with recent strikes and recent violence. But when I look at it, I feel like part of me just feels as if South Africa is overreaching slightly. So I think we should watch for being too closely involved in the politics of a sovereign nation. So that's just my comment there. I always say that, African countries should assist each other. But I think we should also watch for, mixing of signals and crossing of wires, because I'm just thinking, is this really the platform for Cyril?
Interesting view there, Zama. I thought we agreed that, firstly, it's a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because even if you compare back to a similar scenario a couple of years back under President Thabo Mbeki and the issue of Zimbabwe. Back then, we criticized former President Mbeki for his policy of silent diplomacy as one of the reasons that let the situation play out into, its worst case scenario. And at the same time, yes, we understand, obviously, there will always be criticism that the country intervening with its neighbors is overstepping the boundaries of sovereignty, etc. But I think, look, in the context of SADC and the collective goal of the region in promoting peace, it is necessary. We didn't say that SADC or South Africa was overreaching when they were putting together a joint regional force to intervene in the problem of violence in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique. We also have never felt the same way when, even as Deputy President Cyril Ramaphosa was sent to lead SADC envoys and indeed bilateral envoys to Lesotho in intervening in the political skirmishes that led to various changes in government and dissolving of parliament in Lesotho. So I think that we do have our priorities sort of mixed as a country generally, in that we're quick to intervene, obviously, in cases like Lesotho, personally, because I believe we want to secure our interest in water supply. But in countries that obviously have nothing for us to gain from, such as Zimbabwe, and I would argue also Eswatini, we're very slow or lackadaisical in our approach. But Sbu, you have a view about, the president's long game and his strategy.
Yes, my view is a bit contrary to what Zama's view is, because I think there is no pressure. There are also all these hallmarks of the South African president's style of leadership. Like you're saying, the long game, crossing these T's and dotting I's. Where is the agency in SADC? Because he stands for, he is representing SADC. People have been injured here and people have died. And then there is an informal state of emergency that prevails in the country. 46 people are said to have been killed in June. And at least 245 people suffered gunshot wounds. So the Eswatini government, again, King Mswati, they're saying that he will convene a meeting himself. I mean, it's King Mswati will draft the agenda for the talks, and he will set the tone. Mere minutes before the statement was released, the Eswatini government had already announced in a press conference that the king had decided that the national dialogue will be held through the Isibaya and only after the Inwala ceremony, which is scheduled for December, and it might last up until the end of January. So we're only looking at something like February for this Isibaya meeting. And a few years ago, I mean, in 2016, there was a certain Mr. Mkalipi who made representations that were critical of the king. Just after that meeting, that Isibaya meeting, the police attacked him and his family. Up till today, he still lives in fear, having he had to run away from his village, and his livestock was taken away by the king. So it is no wonder that organizations like Pudemo see this as just another failed intervention by SADC. The only person that managed to reprimand King Mswati was former President Nelson Mandela way back in 1996, I think. So I suppose President Mandela also he's a traditional leader, so he could, and he was an elder. But I mean, someone has to talk sense to this king.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the SA update. US and Europe to finance just transition in SA. South Africa entered into a partnership with the governments of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and the United States and the European Union to support a just transition to a low-carbon economy and a climate-resilient society. Ahead of the COP26 conference, South Africa submitted a revised Nationally Determined Contribution, NDC, to reduce domestic carbon emissions by approximately 25% by 2030. The partnership aims to provide 131 billion rand, approximately $8.5 billion, through a range of instruments including grants and concessional finance to support the implementation of the revised NDC in South Africa over the next 3 to 5 years. Approximately half of these funds are expected to go towards implementation of the National Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, which includes interventions such as enhancing the early warning, vulnerability and adaptation monitoring system, promoting research and development in application, localization, transfer, and adoption of technology within key climate-sensitive sectors, mainstreaming climate considerations in all policy frameworks and enhancing the national system of reporting, and strengthening institutional capacity for climate change for 2021 to 2030. Zama, you raised a few things about how this process is actually leading African countries into further debt and indebtedness.
100%, yeah. So I just think, particularly from the South African perspective, I think we just keep going further and further into debt as a nation. And another point I'm raising is that the hard reality is that this money may not even be used for the purpose which it was allocated, and or not efficiently used, given the history of how our government implements its grants. And when I say history, the most recent example that I could make mention of was the 500 billion COVID-19 relief funds that we were given. And, there has been some, tensions around those. So now we have carbon funding, and, I just find that I feel we're leaving the next generation of leaders with a huge economic recovery mess. I'm thinking, I know that carbon is important. I know that climate change is important. And I know that this is what we need to generally focus on. But I'm saying surely carbon is not at the top of the list of the priorities for things that we should be asking for money for as a nation. I don't know what your views are on that.
Yeah, no, I think you're raising a very pertinent question. I think, again, our leaders and I think the world isn't really learning the lesson here. And I think for me, the central lesson is that, development is not development whilst it's leaving certain, population groups, certain continents, certain race groups, genders, etc. in the past, behind. So basically, what I'm saying is there's no development whilst we're still leaving people in the past. I said this when people were talking about the fourth industrial revolution. Africa has not even experienced the first industrial revolution. We're still using, manual tools for things like agriculture. We haven't mechanized our production of food, etc. And the point I was making is that it's quite pointless to talk of this sort of frontier world whilst a lot of people are still dealing with the rudimentary issues of development. The pandemic was a space where, again, that lesson should have been learned. And what we saw was actually vaccine hoarding as opposed to equitable distribution for something that clearly cannot be resolved without a equitable distribution of the vaccine or response to this thing. Same thing with climate change. And the pity is that the biggest contributing polluters globally aren't really in the priority in terms of how they're going to restructure their economies, their production lines, etc., in order to reduce what should be the most effective strategy. And instead, we've got, again, mixed priorities focusing on country number 15 in the top 20 polluting countries globally. At the end of the day, it comes down to competing interests in terms of competing challenges for development domestically versus this sort of global view. And again, it brings back that thing, what are countries going to be prioritizing, which is precisely your point, Sama. Smooth, what are your views on this one?
Yeah, it's no secret that the South African government sees this as a great achievement in their quest to sort out Eskom's incapacity. So they want to deal with the current energy crisis and Eskom's high debt levels. Now, the South African government are sticking to a policy of external debt instruments rather than financing the balance sheet of Eskom from the fiscus, or maybe just leaning on the central bank to say, hey, SARP, please rescue Eskom using your monetary tools, things like giving them a loan at repo rate levels, not this repo rate plus 3% type of scenario. So there's a big conversation among many academics and economic activists because they ask themselves a number of questions. Why is there a rush to decarbonize, or why is there a need? I know that there is a need, but many people still don't. They find this odd. And then another question is, why is Africa and the developing world, why are they being sacrificed for the sins of the global north? Because we're still developing, we still need to catch up. There are all these debates. So what is clear and certain is that Eskom needs the finance, and that the green energy super cycle that includes private capital will become hegemonic. It will be the thing. Now, how South Africa manages all of this is a serious point of political economy debate or dialogue, and this will be. We will debate this for the foreseeable future, in my view. Yeah.
On that note, that takes us to the last story in the SA update: record high fuel prices. The Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, DMRE, announced a massive fuel price hike of R1.21 per litre of petrol, R1.45 per litre of paraffin, and R1.48 per litre of diesel. This brings the pump price of petrol to a record high of approximately R20 per litre, approximately $1.30 per litre. And the DMRE stated the main reasons for this increase as the rise in crude oil prices depreciation of the rand, implementation of the slate levy. In October, the average price of Brent crude oil increased from $75.5 a barrel to $83.4 a barrel, and the average rand exchange rate against the US dollar depreciated from 14.56 to 14.72 per US dollar. And the slate levy on diesel increased from 13 cents per litre to 15 cents. And at these levels, the pump price of petrol is equivalent to approximately $4.9 per gallon, whilst the US average gas prices are currently $3.40 per gallon. This illustrates an additional cost of around $1.50 per gallon, approximately 6 rand per litre, in total levies that are added onto the basic fuel cost. Zama, you're saying this is ditto on your earlier points about the debt problem in the country.
Yes, I really think so, because I mean, if we're going to attribute the rise of this, the crude oil prices, and some of the reasons, if we're going to talk about what some of the reasons are and note that the depreciation of the rand are some of the reasons, I mean, this does really speak to some of the debt issues in this country. I mean, just today, Sia, I was going to pour petrol and we asked the petrol attendant, like, how much is it now per litre? It's essentially 20 rand per litre of petrol. It's crazy.
That's where we are. It's terrible. It's terrible. And I guess for me, the bigger concern is, where are we headed in terms of inflation a couple of maybe weeks or months down the line? We'll have to watch and see. Smoo, you had a point about the additional 6 rand a litre that South Africans are paying and how that's linked to the rentier state, as you call it.
Yeah, this 6 rand 10 cents per litre can be said to be a boon for our rentier state, because on the one, we've got one of those contradictory policy positions here, and this defines how we view economic policies in the country. On the one hand, the state coffers will increase, while on the other hand, the demand for goods and services will decrease because of the higher transportation costs. And this happens in an economy that is more than 60% dependent on consumer spending. The taxman also smiled just a few months ago, last year, when the country raked in excess revenues due to the recent, the short-lived commodity booms. So instead of trying to beneficiate our mineral resources, we ship the rocks off to the nearest point to make a quick buck. And instead of producing more manufactured goods for export and gaining foreign currency revenue to boost our local currency, we pride ourselves with being the top 2 citrus fruit and wine exporters. I mean, these are primary goods. They have no value, not much value has been put in. So we are paying an extra 5 rand per litre since January 2021, because not only the oil price appreciation, the reason for all of this is because it's not only the oil price appreciation, it's also the rand, our exchange rate. The rand has depreciated quite significantly against the US dollar. So I am one of those who advocates for a stronger local currency so that we can import these things like fuels much cheaper, so we can drive this economy.
But already now you are contradicting yourself, and I think this is the problem of economic policy. So I think firstly, South Africa is like, we've given up on economic policy, because exactly what you paint out as a picture is true. The increase on the fuel prices is going to help the fiscal budget, but it's obviously going to hurt consumers, and it's obviously going to raise the cost of supplying goods on the market. But again, a strong rand, which I think what you're advocating for is an export-led growth model, which is to say we should be producing more products locally and exporting these, relies on a weaker rand so that our goods, our exports, are actually cheaper to the rest of the world. So there are some of the contradictions in why I say you're contradicting yourself here by saying you're looking for a stronger rand, because that would make our exports more expensive. But it's precisely also the problem in that a stronger rand allows us to consume goods and import goods and actually undercuts our capacity to produce those goods locally. But let's park that. That's a discussion for another day. Why I say we've given up on policy in SA is because policy generally tends to stimulate one of two sides. You're either demand driven, which means you're looking at making things cheaper for consumers. You are looking to ensure that households have got more disposable incomes, which means you're reducing some of the tax burden that households have. You're reducing also whatever kind of, you're providing a social wage first also in your public services, but basically trying to create more spending capacity for households. We're not doing that. Increases in fuel, in administered prices that are raising also not just the cost on consumers, but the cost of supply with critical energy such as fuel is not a good approach. On the other hand, policy can also be... But I just want to make this point that on the other side, you can also stimulate supply. And that's definitely not what's happening by raising the cost of fuel and logistical energy costs. But as you say, it's a discussion for another day. We've basically given up on economic policy in the country, and it's quite sad. On that note, that brings an end to the SA update this week. Just a reminder to our listeners on whatever platform you're on, please hit the subscribe button, and if you're enjoying this episode, hit us with a like and share it amongst your family and friends. On that note, that brings us to the Africa Regional Update this week. And our first story is the SADC SIPS takes form. A Botswana company, Cali Clothing, is creating a new production line of reusable unisex scrubs and surgical gowns, and employing an additional 14 people after receiving a €100,000 grant under the Support Towards Industrialization and the Productive Sectors SIPS in the Southern African Development Communities Regional Program. The grant will finance the acquisition of machinery and raw materials to create new production line with an expected daily production capacity of 500 medical scrubs and 200 surgical gowns that will be exported to other SADC countries. Cali Clothing is one of 14 companies that have received support under the SIPS program, which is co-funded by the European Union and the government of Germany and managed by the SADC Secretariat. The SIPS COVID-19 Relevant Medical Pharmaceutical Products Program aims to scale up the manufacture of hand sanitizers, hospital disinfectants, and ventilators, in addition to the personal protective equipment. Zama, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think that it's a positive development for ensuring health infrastructure in Africa, and I'm pleased to see the EU and Germany making positive contributions to the development of the African nation. So I do see this as a positive development.
Definitely agree with you. Sbu, you also are in agreement.
Yes, I am in agreement. Yeah. I'm not one for grants, but I'm in agreement on this one, and I'm not trying to be contradictory. There is a grant towards increasing production. There are two different grants. There is, self-reliance is admirable, and it has to be pursued. I am against African countries relying on aid for consumption purposes. But aid should be used for production, to produce your own, to be self-reliant in that way. In our traditions, in our African traditions, we have a word for this concept. It's called Intsengo Ubeka, roughly translated, looking over your shoulder while you're milking the cow. In the old days, pauper was not just supplied with milk. He was not just given alms. He was given at least one cow to milk for his family, to look after the cow and to ensure that it eventually has offspring. So he was expected to return the cow and keep the calf for himself. Hence, he was always looking over his shoulder to check whether the real owner of the cow will be coming to collect. So it was a production grant in that way.
Sure.
It's not this business of giving people 350 rands for consumption, or the much muted BIG, the basic income grant, which does not result in any social dividend.
Yes.
There's no calf there. So that's Ubuntunomics for you, Zama. Yeah.
Thank you. That is it. That is it.
On that note, that takes us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update: ECOWAS-AU collaboration on peace and security. The AU, African Union Commissioner for Peace and Security, Ambassador Bankole Adeyo, paid a working visit to the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS Commission's Department of Political Affairs, Peace and Security in Abuja. The AU and ECOWAS pledged to intensify their existing collaboration on peace and security during this meeting. Relations between ECOWAS and AU will now focus on fully establishing the Africa Standby Force, ASF, integrating capacity through peace support operations, and the meeting also discussed improvements of knowledge sharing on early warning, conflict prevention and mediation, and operationalizing the ASF and deploying 3,000 troops to the Sahel region. Zama, you are praising this ASF, or African Standby Force.
Definitely, this is another positive development. I think it's just going to be interesting to see how this ASF actually develops.
Yeah, and I hope it's going to be effective, at least perhaps with the support of the UN and other multinational forces. They will be able to control the Sahel. On that note, it brings us to the next story in the Africa Regional Update: UN Peacekeepers Attacked in the CAR, Central African Republic. 10 unarmed Egyptian peacekeepers from the UN Stabilization Mission in the Central African Republic, MINUSCA, were shot and wounded on Monday. The peacekeepers arrived at the Bangui Mpoko International Airport as part of their periodic rotation and troop deployment in the CAR. And while en route to their base, the elements of the police unit came under fire from the Presidential Guard without any prior warning or response. In its attempt to withdraw from the area located about 120 meters from the presidential residence, the peacekeepers' transport bus struck a woman who lost her life. The leadership of MINUSCA and the government of the CAR immediately opened an investigation into the deadly incident, including examining the event in accordance with legal obligations outlined in the Status of Forces Agreement. Following years of civil unrest, MINUSCA was established in the United Nations Security Council by the United Nations Security Council in 2014 to provide security, humanitarian, human rights, and political support in the country. A total of 157 peacekeepers have lost their lives in the line of duty in the CAR. These attacks happened just 2 weeks after the CAR President Faustin Archange Touadera announced a unilateral ceasefire in the country. Sbu, what are your thoughts on this one?
I find that there is a serious lack of integrity among the warring parties in the CAR. Maybe it's a clash of cultures, others coming from the north, and others from the south, the Muslim-Christian divide. I don't know what there is, but there is a lot of mistrust. I can't just put my finger in it, though. A ceasefire has to be upheld in order to get somewhere. One would have thought that the people in the country are tired of war by now, after almost a decade of misery for the common people. This war started way back in 2012, 2013. And so these peacekeepers clearly posed no danger to anyone. The ambush is said to have been orchestrated. I am also very concerned about the presence of Russian mercenaries in that part of the world, and other external forces who profit from the current state of turmoil. So the first call should have been to immediately withdraw all foreign forces. This was supposed to be policed by the UN, or maybe this African Standing Force, if it had been set up long ago, as we've always bemoaned. From a relative calm, parties are able to maintain a ceasefire. They should be able to maintain a ceasefire if there is calm and start negotiating. So it is not clear.
I want to push back a bit though, Spo, because your
Yes,
indictment that they should remove all foreign forces it's a bit unrealistic. I mean, these are countries who can't defend their own borders and need the assistance of these multinational forces, and hence also the existence of UN forces, because the domestic forces are insufficient on their own. It's just a pity that there's so many lines that are crossed, that even amidst this unilateral ceasefire, there's the same parties who are leading the unilateral ceasefire, the ones firing against peacekeepers who are unarmed. It's terrible, and it speaks also to the nature of these peacekeeping operations, that there's a lot of mistrust, as you've raised. On that note, that brings us to the last story in the Africa Regional Update. Southern Madagascar faces climate famine. So-called pockets of famine have been reported in what is basically the only and perhaps the first climate change famine in southern Madagascar by the World Food Programme, WFP. According to the WFP, the situation is worse than any food insecurity on the continent, including those resulting from emergencies in the DRC, Central African Republic, and Sudan. In total, half of the 2.6 million Malagasy people facing food insecurity have been classified IPC 3, 4, and 5, all the way from crises to famine-level food insecurity. In contrast to the world's other IPC 5 famines in Yemen, South Sudan, and Ethiopia, specifically Tigray, which are all conflict-driven, the Madagascar crisis is likely the result of just devastating climate factors on the country alone. Sbu, you had a point about how long this drought has lasted and how we should be dealing with these.
Yeah, the drought has been going on for 4 years, and the people are unable to plant. Livestock has died because of lack of water and grazing. Now, families there send out their children to go collect swarms of locusts, which have become their only source of protein. They dry them up and they roast them and eat them. So when there's been a little bit of rain, these locusts come out from their burrows and they are the only thing that they are surviving on. So the southern part of the country is very remote and it's underdeveloped. The government of Madagascar have done very little to ameliorate the situation. They rely on aid. So when a country just mainly relies on aid and can't feed itself, then you have disaster there will be disaster.
Definitely. And instead of trying to feed the hungry, you'll find that countries are now going to be financing green energy in Madagascar. Just kidding. Zama, you had a point about the role that SADC should be playing in this crisis.
Yes, I mean, yes to everything that you're saying, and this kind of speaks to, I think, what I'm trying to get across in terms of what SADC should be doing. And I agree that, there's really no right or wrong, but as you say, Spoo, this has been going on for 4 years, right? So that's quite a long time. So I believe that this is the kind of issue that SADC should step up to the plate for and assist the government, in feeding its people and alleviating the strain caused by a climate famine. So whether it's actually, food parcels, which we know that that's not necessarily sustainable in the long term, but actually focusing on, sustainable sort of infrastructure goals or, such, implementations that would actually see this being dealt with, because 4 years is quite a long time for this to be going on with no intervention.
Yeah. No, it's very terrible. I think in as much as African states have presented quite strong resilience in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic impact of the pandemic, we also have very fragile states, and I think Madagascar is one of those, and it just goes to show how a terrible situation can turn into a dire situation simply because government has got no means or any approach in intervening and trying to resolve the crisis. On that note, that brings an end to the Africa Regional Update this week. And this takes us to the numbers game.
Yeah.
All right. So the number for this week is actually rounded off to 46% in 2021. What do you guys think this number is related to? Zama?
I think it might be related to households in debt, total households in debt in South Africa.
Interesting. No. Sorry, Zama. The number is not related to household debt indebtedness. Smoo, wanna give it a go?
Okay.
40. That's a big number. I suppose it has to do with the elections. I would say it has to do with the participation rate or something like that.
You know how close it is, Smoo, that when you step on someone's corns, they can feel you before you've hit the corn. But you're very close, but no cigar. So actually, the number this week is ANC support drops to 46% in the 2021 local government elections. So South Africa held its 2021 local government elections on Monday, the 1st of November, following what has been dubbed the most contested election in South Africa's history. The ruling African National Congress ANC lost significant support since the 2016 local government elections. Support for the ANC dropped to 46% of the vote, from a 53.9% in 2016, followed by the Democratic Alliance, whose support dropped to 21.8% from 26.9% in 2016. Meanwhile, the Economic Freedom Fighters EFF increased their support to 10.4% from 8.2% in 2016. This illustrates the shifting local political terrain in South Africa, with smaller opposition parties like the EFF and Freedom Front Plus, which increased their support to 2.5% from 0.8% in 2016. In addition, the number of hung councils where no political party achieved an outright majority have increased to 70 in the 2021 local government elections from 27 hung councils in 2016.
Wow.
So there you have it, folks, down to 46% in the 2021 local government elections.
Yeah, it's slipping away, and one wonders whether they have learned anything, because they keep on saying that it has got to do with corruption, it's got to do with that, but they're not facing facts that it has to do with not keeping promises and the current economic crisis, including the highest unemployment rates and all of that. It's just, anyway.
Yeah. Agreed. I love to see it, not in the sense that they're losing numbers, but in the sense that we're seeing, with people not just complaining about the fact that, the ANC is not doing this, the ruling party is not doing this, but I love to see that people are actually doing something about it and actually saying, we want to exercise our democratic rights and we want to see change. So I think that's positive, that the country's not saying, we want change, and then they're not doing anything about it. So I think that's good. But, it should be a good lesson for them, or a warning for them to step up for the upcoming national elections.
Yeah, definitely. My biggest worry, though, is, the impact on governance. As a country that's not used to, being driven by coalitions, and the fact that major metros in the country are now going to be run by coalitions.
Yep.
Yes.
On that note, that brings an end to our show this week. Africa.